They said it was the most dramatic economic warning shot of the century. A jaw-dropping 150% tariff that Donald Trump allegedly threatened to slap on any nation foolhardy enough to challenge the almighty American dollar. No bullets fired, no warships launched, just a menacing tax measure that screamed, "Don't mess with the USD or prepare to pay." But here's the irony nobody expected. The counterstrike came not from missiles or fighter jets, but from a silent uprising in global finance led by an alliance known as BRICS. These nations, once considered afterthoughts in a Western-dominated system, started forging a parallel economic universe. And now, Washington faces a question it's never had to ask before. What if the world no longer bows to the dollar? If you think that sounds like conspiracy talk, buckle up, because what's lurking behind the scenes might just reshape the entire financial order before you can say greenback. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on a story that's all but invisible on mainstream headlines, and it could rock your next paycheck, your investments, even your sense of who truly holds power in the 21st century. Trump was never one to mince words, especially when it came to defending what he saw as America's strongest weapon, the US dollar. As president, he witnessed firsthand how countries like China, Russia, India, and Brazil were inching closer to a future where they'd no longer rely on greenbacks to do business. To many, that sounded like a pipe dream, but to Trump, it was a direct threat. So, in classic Trump style, he signaled a punitive strike in the form of a monstrous 150% tariff. It wasn't some half-baked scheme to collect more tax money from foreign goods. It was a line in the sand. The message was clear. If you come for our dollar, you come for our entire financial empire. Inside Washington, eyebrows shot up. Analysts, economists, and corporate lobbyists scrambled to do damage control. After all, the U.S. economy is deeply woven into the global marketplace. Picking a fight of this scale had all the subtlety of a wrecking ball. But for Trump, subtlety was never the point. He believed the U.S. had spent nearly a century building dollar dominance and wasn't about to let newcomers knock it off its throne. Back in the day, a threat like that might have left rising economies quaking. Yet this time, the reaction was anything but fear. Instead, the presidents and prime ministers of these challenger nations took a deep breath and quietly chose a different road. Enter BRICS: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. That acronym might sound academic, but behind it stands nearly half the world's population and, collectively, a massive chunk of global GDP. On paper, these 5 nations had always planned to cooperate on economic matters. In reality, they often moved at a snail's pace, each wrestling with its own agendas. Then came Trump's tariff ultimatum. Suddenly, cooperation took on a new urgency. They realized that so long as the U.S. controlled the financial gates, from SWIFT networks to the default reliance on dollars for cross-border deals, these emerging giants would always be playing by American rules. So they hatched a blueprint. A new independent payment system that wouldn't revolve around the U.S. Federal Reserve. Rumors flew about the possibility of a BRICS digital currency, maybe even one pegged to gold. It sounded wild at first, but consider that China has ramped up gold buying for years, Russia has shifted a huge chunk of its reserves out of USD into gold, and India's centuries-old gold culture is practically woven into everyday life. Throw in Brazil's resource wealth and South Africa's mining clout, and you suddenly have a group with both the motive and the means to undermine the greenback kingdom. Even more shocking, the seeds of a blockchain-based system quietly took root, free from Western oversight, immune to the dreaded sanctions freeze that the U.S. Treasury can drop at the stroke of a pen. This was an evolution in global economics. No stirring speeches, no big declarations, just clandestine agreements and swift behind-the-scenes progress. And ironically, none of it would have accelerated so quickly had Trump not wielded the threat of triple-digit tariffs like a sledgehammer. No single day ever spelled doom for the dollar. Instead, an unsettling drip-drip effect started to eat away at it. Countries began doing oil deals without involving U.S. currency. OPEC behemoths like Saudi Arabia quietly signed transactions with China in yuan. Russia, shut out of SWIFT after its Ukraine invasion, found ways to settle trades via rubles, rupees, or other local currencies. Meanwhile, the rest of the world couldn't help but notice how easily the U.S. had weaponized the greenback, freezing entire countries' reserves whenever policy friction arose. That's when the seeds of doubt truly began to sprout. The sacred foundation of the dollar's dominance, the petrodollar system, faces its first real cracks since the mid-20th century. Back in the day, the U.S. cut a deal with major oil producers to price all oil transactions in USD, ensuring global dependence on the greenback. For decades, it worked brilliantly. Countries had to keep dollars in their reserves just to buy energy, but once the facade of total U.S. goodwill slipped and the threat of crippling sanctions loomed, alternatives looked more appealing than ever. What's truly mind-boggling is the change in mindset. Central banks worldwide, from the Middle East to Asia, have quietly decreased their U.S. dollar holdings in favor of gold. They see it as a hedge, an ancient metal that Washington can't lock behind a digital firewall. Will the dollar vanish tomorrow? Absolutely not. But the unstoppable truth is that once folks start seeing the king's armor crack, it's hard to unsee it. It would be naive to think BRICS is a perfect family. Under the shiny veneer, old rivalries simmer. Chief among them is the uneasy dance between China and India, two of the world's most populous nations, both sporting nuclear capabilities and a recent history of border flare-ups. China, with its deep pockets and strategic Belt and Road Initiative, often tries to steer BRICS from behind the curtain. India, proud of its own economic and geopolitical clout, won't accept playing second fiddle. So while they agree on wanting less U.S. interference, the idea of a BRICS currency sparks major concerns in New Delhi. After all, who would anchor that currency? If it's China, India fears it'd be the same trap as the Western system, just with Beijing in charge instead of Washington. Brazil also eyes China's dominance warily. They recognize that as soon as a single giant calls the shots, the original dream of a multipolar order morphs into another lopsided arrangement. In other words, BRICS isn't monolithic. It's a patchwork of alliances and distrusts. But ironically, that patchwork might also be its strength. They don't have a rigid hierarchy like NATO, so they're more adaptable. Each member invests at its own pace, forging new payment channels, deals, and local currency swaps that nibble at the edges of the dollar-based system. It's less about big declarations than a series of small but relentless shifts. While big players like China or India can shake the global economy outright, Cuba's membership in the expanded BRICS Plus rattles the geopolitical scene on a more symbolic level. For over 6 decades, the U.S. embargo caged Cuba's economy, cutting it off from mainstream international finance. Yet the moment Cuba stepped under the BRICS umbrella, it was like the U.S. blockade lost a chunk of its sting. After all, if Cuba can trade freely with a massive coalition outside American oversight, the old rules start to crumble. On top of that, it's an audacious move in Washington's own backyard. Throughout the Cold War, the mere presence of Soviet missiles in Cuba nearly triggered a nuclear standoff. Now, with a new era of financial warfare, having BRICS networks operating on the island is a bold statement. The US doesn't call all the shots here anymore. Moscow leapt at the chance to champion Cuba's membership, viewing it as sweet payback for decades of US sanctions. China, too, recognized the strategic advantage of edging deeper into the Caribbean, historically labeled an American no-go zone. And so, a small island took on a giant role, simply by rejecting the dollar-based chains that once defined its fate. Traditionally, whenever a foreign power defied U.S. interests, Washington had a tried-and-true formula: sanctions, isolation, or a swift ejection from the SWIFT system. For years, that approach worked like a charm. The threat alone was enough to keep most countries in line, terrified of losing access to the global dollar pipeline. But times changed. The U.S. froze Russian assets, hammered countries like Iran and Venezuela, and even threatened close allies with secondary sanctions. It was the financial equivalent of a nuclear option, and it eventually prompted the rest of the world to say, "We need a Plan B." Now, with BRICS forging that Plan B, Washington faces a dilemma. If it intensifies its crackdown, slapping 150% tariffs on more nations, or cutting them off from U.S. markets, those countries will only fast-track their exodus from the dollar. But if America does nothing, it looks weak, letting a major challenge to its currency go unanswered. Politically, it's a lose-lose scenario. Voices in Congress are split. Some demand heavier reprisals, while more cautious elements warn that every new sanction boomerangs back, pushing the global South to unify around BRICS. To complicate matters, big U.S. corporations, banks, tech giants, energy players have billions at stake in places like China and India. They're not thrilled about fueling a new Cold War that forces them to abandon those enormous markets. The more Washington tries to punish rogue nations, the more it risks punishing its own corporate interests. And so the U.S. stares at the same disquieting truth. The old weaponization of the dollar can still do damage, but it's no longer the unstoppable sledgehammer it used to be. Each time it's swung, countries inch further away from the greenback altogether. As the dust settles, one realization stands out. The battle for global financial supremacy isn't just about Trump's shock tariff or one big, bold move from the U.S. or BRICS. It's about a steady erosion of trust in a one-currency system. The more the U.S. cracks down, the more impetus it gives the rest of the world to build an alternative. And that alternative might not be polished or unified. BRICS is riddled with competing agendas, different political models, and economic friction. Yet the momentum is real. From experimental payment channels to gold-backed currency whispers, they're forging stepping stones toward a multi-currency future. Can the dollar survive? Likely yes, but maybe not in the position of uncontested king. In a matter of years, we could witness a world where the US dollar no longer commands the final say. BRICS doesn't need to tear the old system down overnight. They just need to offer a feasible route around it. As that route expands, American influence naturally contracts. So here we stand at a precarious turning point. If you find yourself gripping those dollar bills and wondering whether they'll still dominate in a decade, you're not alone. Because the new question echoing through finance ministries from Beijing to Brasilia and from New Delhi to Havana is, why should we keep paying tribute to a throne that might crumble beneath our feet? And the scariest part for the old guard in Washington? Once a kingdom's subjects discover they can survive without the king, the monarchy never really goes back to what it was. Who wins this race? No one can say for sure. The U.S. still wields impressive financial firepower, and BRICS still grapples with internal tensions. But one thing is certain: the game board is shifting, and everyone is playing for keeps. Perhaps the real takeaway is to stay alert. Because if the USD vs. BRICS showdown has taught us anything, It's that when big powers collide without a single shot fired, the fallout can be far more world-changing than any war of bullets and bombs. That's the secret drama unfolding behind headlines. The transformation of money, power, and the intangible beliefs we've built around them. And whichever side you stand on, Team Dollar or Team BRICS, one fact stands out. The future is already taking shape, quietly, relentlessly, and in plain sight for those who care to look. This script is designed to flow like an exciting story told to a friend, highlighting shocking turns, controversies, and behind-the-scenes maneuvering. Each section opens with something new, references, but doesn't repeat, the main theme, and maintains a conversational, slightly mysterious tone. We've also avoided any stage directions or repeated intros, focusing instead on punchy transitions and bold statements to keep viewers watching until the very end.